Get ready to take a flamethrower to the official narrative and learn what the elites don't want you to know. You're listening to The Tom Woods Show.
Hey everybody, Tom Woods here. It's episode 2565 of The Tom Woods Show. I got Scott Horton here, and I'm just telling you, it's a quirk of my recording schedule that I'm broadcasting the week of the election. I'm releasing this episode the day after the election, and I don't know what happened. Maybe they're still counting the votes. Maybe one of them is the clear winner. I have no idea. Scott has no idea. So I thought, well, what am I going to do that people might nevertheless be interested in? And then it came to me. Then it came to me and entered the old noodle. I thought to myself, everybody wants to know about Scott Horton's new book. And so we're going to talk about that because that's relevant no matter who wins. And the book we're talking about is now I got to dig it because I don't have the tab open anymore because I had it already with the subtitle. There it is. Okay. I just put it in here. There it is. Okay. The book is called Provoked, and the subtitle is How Washington Started the New Cold War with Russia and the Catastrophe in Ukraine. You know everything there is to know about Scott Horton already. He's the greatest expert in the history of the world on foreign policy from our standpoint, and he is just the hardest working guy out there in terms of how much content he's put out, how much he does, how thankless the work he does is. And here he is talking to us. Scott, welcome back.
Well, thank you very much, Tom. Certainly that last part about hard working is true. But yeah, thank you, man. I appreciate it.
Oh, Jesus, he put effort into this. And I think it's going to bear fruit in that I think it's going to get. And the thing is that Scott's not even really looking for a bigger platform. He's just doing his work, and what happens, happens. But I think this particular contribution is going to get Scott some, it's just my prediction, is get him some big time attention. So what we're going to do.
Now, you've read the whole thing now, right?
I have read the entire thing. Not all the notes, which are right on the same page as the text, which, you can argue whether, that's the best way, but I get it. I like them on the same page because I want to be able to check it right off the bat, not have to flip. So I'm totally with you.
And I'm making controversial claims, so I want you to be able to check me, especially when you doubt me right there,
That is right. I absolutely agree. In fact, when the Politically Incorrect Guide to American History came out, they initially said, well, we don't want any footnotes in it because we don't want it to seem like a scholarly book. We want it to be like a fun book. Okay, so I didn't put them in. And so then inevitably, what's your source for? And then so for all the other ones, they allowed footnotes. So now it just looks like I'm just uniquely refusing to share my sources, unlike everybody else in this series. So anyway, let's not talk about footnotes. Let's get into this. So what we're going to do is, it's a big book. There's just no getting around. It's a big book. And it is fodder for multiple episodes of any podcast. So I want to start off with some of the early material, and then we're going to give you a link to pre-order, because when do you actually expect it to be physically in people's hands?
2 weeks. You ever see The Money Pit with Tom Hanks and Shelley Long?
Oh, yeah, it's true. It's always 2 weeks, and then
that's me.
Months and months go by. Huh?
Yeah. Okay. But I'm like blood oath sworn now. It's got to be out by Thanksgiving because all gears stop turning in the publication business at
Christmas
Thanksgiving time. We learned this last year, went through hell to getting your book out and Jim's book out. So there's that. And I want it to be available for Christmas time and everything for a lot of times people just buy one big book a year or something. I hope it'll be this one. And then, also, I'm just sick and tired of rereading the same thing I already wrote.
Oh, no, you can't take it anymore.
I'm doing one last read through now, and then it's all technical, table of contents, page numbers, and chapter headings, and then hit the button. So give me 2 weeks, man, and then I swear by Thanksgiving, it'll be available. We are taking pre-orders now at provokedbook.com, and that will forward you to my website, scotthorton.org/provoked.
All right, provokedbook.com. That's a good one. All right, so let's dive into the basics of the very, very beginnings of this. And for the very beginnings of this, we're going to the end of the Cold War. Now, in my blurb for this book, I am describing you as having taken your place among the great revisionist historians. Now, revisionism, that word, revisionist historian, that term, has a bad reputation because people think of it as it's some kind of leftist thing that we have our great proud American history, and then the revisionists come along and say, now wait a minute, Thomas Jefferson actually, but that's not the revisionism we're talking about. What revisionism just means there's a standard way of looking at things, and maybe that's wrong, and sometimes the standard way of looking at things is born out of the events themselves. But now that time has passed since the events themselves, we can take a look at these events with fresh, unbiased eyes and see if the narrative really holds up. And so that's the sense in which you are a great revisionist. And the real revisionists, from what I understand in terms of foreign policy, really got their start after World War I, because it was in the Treaty of Versailles that Germany was uniquely guilty. That was actually in the treaty. And the revisionists saw it as their role to spread knowledge of the truth for the sake of peace. And I view you as doing exactly that in this book. Is that how you think of it as well?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's how I think of the book and the work. Not myself. I take your compliment very kindly, Tom. And seeing how you went to all these fancy colleges and stuff, you really would know. So that's very nice of you to say. But yes, look, I am very much a student of James Bovard and Noam Chomsky and, whatever, a bunch of others, libertarians and leftists. But what I mean by that in terms of the writing style is just to pummel you with truth until you admit that I didn't know that. Okay. And then now that we're on the same page about what really happened, well, then you can see how we should definitely not do this then. You know what I mean? So like if for example, a huge part of what caused the war on terrorism was American intervention in the Middle East in the first place. And this was a reaction to that rather than the first day in history that we were only reacting to. Well, then we have an entire different way of understanding the war on terrorism and how to tackle it, right? You would want to do like what Ron Paul said would be kill as few of the absolutely most guilty people as possible and back off on every other thing that you're doing to turn these people against us and force them to want to attack our country. And it's the same kind of thing here where, the last book could have been called Provoked, right? About, the terrorists' war on us and then our war back on them. It's the same kind of thing here where, yes, Vladimir Putin is a strong man, and he's, of course, played his part in all of this. And yet the Americans, the same ones, basically the same relatively small group of people who are in charge of botching everything in the Middle East are the same ones who determine our policy in Eastern Europe. And they're the same ones as the war on terrorism was developing in Afghanistan and Iraq and around the Middle East. We had this entire process that was going on in Eastern Europe, leading right up to the war of 2022. And so the book is, it's everything that Bush Sr., Bill Clinton, Bush Jr., Obama, Trump, Biden, and of course, John McCain and Hillary Clinton and all the worst power mongers and all their think tankers and hangers on and National Security Council staffers and what they've done, the decisions they've made, how they made them, the debates they had at the time, and why they always knew they were right. To paraphrase Jacob Halpern's, that's the title of his book about the neocons. They knew they were right, even though, of course, that's the joke, because, of course, they weren't. They are completely crazy. Everything that they predicted went completely south. And so, but that's how they all are, from the H.W. Bush. And there was a time where I thought it was really Bill Clinton that had broken Bush's promises, but it was Bush Sr. who broke his own promises. They knew all along that they were lying to the Soviets.
Well, wait, hold on. We'll get to that in a minute. Sure. We'll get to that part. So,
wait, yeah. So that's the point. So that you know the truth, so that you don't believe them anymore, so that you don't support the wrong thing, and hopefully we can build a consensus toward peace.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah, and maybe not trusting these people the next time. I mean, it seems like a vain hope, but maybe you won't trust them the next time. So you start off, or early on, you have this interesting quotation. I had not been aware of this. See, even here I am telling you. Here's something I learned right off the bat. Jean Kirkpatrick was ambassador to the United Nations for part of the 1980s. She was very hawkish. Little Tom Woods, at age 12, was a big Jean Kirkpatrick fan because he didn't know any better.
Okay.
But she gave a great speech at the 84 Republican convention that got me all riled up. Well, but then all of a sudden in 1990, so
little Tom Woods, can't you just picture him, everybody?
I was watching it on TV in my living room all alone. My parents had no interest in this. It was just me. But okay. So 1990 comes along. Now, yeah, it's true. That's more than a year before the formal unraveling of the Soviet Union, but the writing was on the wall. So she writes in the National Interest that now that the Soviet Union appears to be unraveling, and certainly the various Eastern Bloc countries are breaking free, now it's time for us to change course. And she says, and you're quoting her, she speaks about the dubious benefits of superpower status. We should shed those and become again a successful, open American republic, a normal country in a normal time, an independent nation in a world of independent nations. So instead of trying to maintain political and military dominance, America should come home, quote, and take care of pressing problems of education, family, industry, and technology. And then you say, echoing her, was this not the reason the public was told we had fought the First Cold War, namely to preserve our way of life as a free people in our constitutional republic once the emergency subsided? But then you also quote in a rejoinder to Jeane Kirkpatrick, also writing in the National Interest, Charles Krauthammer. And I've read Charles Krauthammer for many years, and it's almost impossible to believe that's his real name, but it is. And he's denouncing Pat Buchanan, Jeane Kirkpatrick, Russell Kirk, and he says the U.S. now rules, quote, a super sovereign West, economically, culturally, and politically hegemonic in the world. I suggest we go all the way and stop at nothing short of universal domination. So you frame this story at the beginning as a question of, with the Cold War over and with NATO seeming to have fulfilled its mission, there were genuine questions about which way forward. And man, was a decision made as to which way forward.
Right. Well, and look, the book is dedicated to Ron Paul, and I quote some Ron Paul in there, but I deliberately chose Jeane Kirkpatrick at that part. And my previous book, I actually quote at length the Russell Kirk speech that I cite there, but I don't quote at length. In the last book I quoted at length, it's a speech that he gave at the Heritage Foundation saying, oh man, what are we doing, guys? We shouldn't be doing this. And, he was one of the founders, like right up here with Buckley after World War II, is one of the founding definers of the conservative movement with his book, The Conscience of a Conservative and all that. So he was an extremely important guy, right? But go ahead.
Well, you're talking about Russell Kirk?
Yeah.
You mean the conservative mind?
Yeah. I'm sorry. The Conscience of a Conservative is Goldwater.
Yeah.
I always screw those two up. I think I read the Goldwater, but not the Kirk. But I always get the titles wrong. Anyways, the point is that, so Jeane Kirkpatrick, she not only was a hawk Tom, she was a neoconservative, a definitional neoconservative. And that doesn't mean a Jewish right-winger, by the way, right? She was a Presbyterian. It means someone who was formerly a leftist and moved to the right and was part of this same sect, this small group of about 100 ex-Trotskyites mostly, who had moved to the right and become Reaganite war hawks. And she fit firmly within that. I always want to say it's Social Democrats USA. That's not true. It's the other one that I was confused with, the Social Democrats USA that she was a part of. But anyway, I have in the footnotes there, someone wrote a PhD about how she was a neoconservative, and it's a whole biography of the evolution of her political thought and everything. It's really interesting. So anyway, I think that's important, that she wasn't just a conservative hawk. She was a neoconservative hawk. And she was saying, okay, enough of that. And Scott McConnell and Pat Buchanan and, Jude Wanniski is another one. He was a neoconservative who said, okay, nuts to that. I'd rather pal around with Pat now. The emergency is over. The commies are gone. And Pat Buchanan, he'd have done anything to stop those commies. But once the commies are gone, well, the only way to save the Constitution is to call off the national emergency. Bring the soldiers home from everywhere. And if you remember back, I'm sure you do at that time, the best they could come up with was, oh no, maybe Germany and Japan are going to come back. Because, the Japanese have been selling us really cheap cars lately. And that's basically the same thing as a global threat. There was no enemy. Bill Hicks had this great joke about there is no threat out there Other than, the people that we sell arms to. And then you're like, oh, what about the people we sell arms to, Bill? Well, we got to go blow them up. But other than that, there's no one out there that's a threat to us. There's no reason to be militarized really at all, other than so that the militarizers don't have to get real jobs. That really was it. And you could have even, again, not the full Ron Paul position, but just arguing from all other things being equal, from a Jeane Kirkpatrick point of view. NATO could still be a treaty. It says America will never allow anyone to beat up on our friends, the French. Fine. But that doesn't mean it has to be this massive bureaucratic military organization of its own in Europe with its own command structure and its own incentives. Let it just be a piece of paper where we promise to help our friends. At least let's start with that, right? This kind of thing. And that was the promise at the start of the Cold War. I think I'm almost certain, Tom, that it was Chalmers Johnson who had explained this to me on my show. He was an old Cold Warrior, CIA analyst and professor at USC, who had said that the idea was if Peter the Great's Russia had just expanded in World War II and dominated all of Eastern Europe, well, that would have been sad, but so what? But this was Soviet communism under Joseph Stalin. So I don't want to hear it. That's different. Right? It's just like Saddam Hussein ain't Hitler, but Hitler was Hitler, right? Well, Stalin was Stalin. So Stalin wasn't Peter the Great and he wasn't Khrushchev. He was Stalin. And so in that case, that Soviet Union just had to be contained by the American superpower on the other side. That was the argument. A lot of people believed that it was true. I'm much more skeptical. If you read Rothbard, For a New Liberty, he's much more skeptical of that take, and there are other revisionists on that. Gareth Porter's writing a book on the origins of the last Cold War now. That's almost finished. But the argument was that this is Soviet communism and therefore different. If it was just the Russian Empire, that would be one thing. But this is the ideology of total enslavement of mankind. And who could argue with the brutality of Soviet communism under Stalin? But so now that that was over, you had people who had remembered that promise saying that, well, okay, bring the troops home then. As Pat put it in his book, we're supposed to be a republic, not an empire. And then sorry, I'm rambling, but the point is, others like Daniel Patrick Moynihan, he was another who was, I don't believe he's literally a neoconservative, but he was often identified as one. He was very close to the neoconservative set, was known as the most intellectual Democrat in the Senate at that time, and was very much like a center-left, Cold Warrior, anti-communist, liberal Democrat, who said, hey, we should abolish the CIA. We should bring the soldiers home. We should get rid of all of this. Expand NATO. Why in the world would we do that? I don't know if he called for abolishing NATO, but he certainly, what I'm trying to say is that when you had the likes of Jeane Kirkpatrick and Daniel Patrick Moynihan joining people like Pat Buchanan and Ron Paul saying, okay, well, now we don't have to do this anymore, then that means that this isn't just the kind of thing that an ideological libertarian like myself or Ron Paul believes, but it's something that was actually very much part of the discussion among all of the real adults in the room, in Washington. As I talk about with NATO expansion itself a little bit later in the book, that 2/3 of the membership of the Council on Foreign Relations opposed NATO expansion. A super majority of the CFR said we should not be doing this. And it was the minority, the connected interests, who got their way over the broad consensus of what even all of Rockefeller's horses and Rockefeller's men thought should be done now.
My charming wife says she wants me to live to be 100, so she helps me look after my health, particularly when, from time to time, my schedule gets stressful. Absolutely true story. She started handing me Super Beats heart chews and said I should have one a day. She'll attest to this. So every day she'd hand me one, and every day I'd consume it. They're individually wrapped, so they're super convenient. And then one day I looked at the package and I realized these people are my newest sponsor. Super Beats Heart Chews offer a convenient, delicious, plant-based way to support healthy blood pressure and circulation. Enjoy a heart-healthy boost without relying on stimulants. Paired with a healthy lifestyle, the unique antioxidant compound in super beets is clinically shown to be nearly 2 times more effective at promoting normal blood pressure than a healthy lifestyle alone. So in addition to my gym regimen and my diet, it's nice to know I'm doing something good for myself every day. They're super easy and convenient. As I say, sometimes my wife will just hand me one as I'm headed out the door. And what's more, they give you heart-healthy energy without the crash. Remember, no stimulants and no artificial sweeteners or colors. Double your potential with Super Beets Heart Chews. Get a free 30-day supply of Super Beets Heart Chews on all bundles and 15% off your first order by going to getsuperbeets.com and using code WOODS. That's getsuperbeets.com, code WOODS. Well, so what I want to talk about then is there are 2 ways in which we can say that NATO did expand. One is the obvious way of introducing more countries into it, but the other way is redefining what its mission is, because at least, however you felt about it, and Robert A. Taft was a critic at the very beginning, as you point out in the book, at least we knew what it was about. And that, but what starts to happen is, as you say, as with anything that becomes, let's say, obsolete, but yet is attached to government, it can't, quote, lose its funding and go out of business. That doesn't happen. Mm-hmm. So you have a passage I'd like to, there's so much of it, I shouldn't read the whole thing, but in talking about the intervention in the Balkans, like the joint effort in Bosnia, this situates that episode, your book situates that episode in the context of a NATO looking for a new mission, for something to do. So this is Scott Horton speaking. NATO needed to go, quote, out of area or out of business, unquote. The Pentagon's RAND Corporation and Senator Lugar agreed. The NSC had been discussing the possibilities in those terms since at least 1990. NATO seeks significance in post-war climate, read a headline in the arms industry magazine Jane's Defense Weekly. They said NATO was, quote, searching for a new identity, unquote, in the absence of the Soviet Union, and cited a threat from Senator William Roth that if they did not hurry up and find something to do, they would be in danger of losing their funding. A senior NATO representative told the Los Angeles Times, quote, NATO must be active in future peacekeeping operations out of area, however complicated, because we alone have the capability. Otherwise, it is fair to ask, what is NATO for, unquote. And then I have to at least read this part. As then Senator Joe Biden put it, quote, ironically, within the fruits of NATO's unparalleled success lie the seeds for its possible demise. Alliances are formed to fight wars or to deter them. Once the adversary is gone, unless alliances adapt to meet changing threats, they lose their reason for being, unquote. And then, of course, but instead of bringing the troops home, we need a, quote, we need a redefinition of NATO's mission. And that's the context in which you go into. Now, we shouldn't get into the details because that Bosnia, I've written some about it too. That's a very complicated question. But that was very much at the forefront of the thinking of American policymakers at that time.
Absolutely right. And they all said it. There's, plenty of quotes from the people themselves, the primary sources themselves, saying this is why we have to do this. And I think without even naming any of the parts of Yugoslavia, Tom, I think I could still just say that what happened was Yugoslavia was breaking up, and the Germans and the Americans rushed in there to make it happen faster and to take black magic markers and draw hard international borders where you had administrative boundaries within one country that were still very much in dispute. And you had different minorities, but especially you had Serbs left behind the lines in Croatia and Bosnia, where they were going to now be oppressed minorities in these new countries. And then so what was supposed to happen to them? That was the controversy. And it was made to be that much worse by the intervention of the American diplomatic corps over there in encouraging the different groups to break apart. And then throughout the Bush years and the Clinton years, well, I should say throughout the Clinton years, but through, early Clinton, throughout Bush and early Clinton, the Americans ruined peace deal after peace deal after peace deal after peace deal. It is unbelievable, the criminal negligence that went into them stopping compromises from being made. By the end of the thing, the side that they took, the Bosnian Muslims, lost more in the final deal than they would have in any of the previous deals that the Americans ruined on, supposedly on their behalf. And somewhere around 100,000 people were killed. And it's a complete catastrophe. And people invoke Bosnia like, yeah, that was some bad stuff that we had to intervene and bring peace. Oh man, no, that's not it. America brought war to that place. And I'm not going to say they made the war happen just so they'd have an excuse to intervene, but I'm saying the intervention A to Z, every part of it was bad. And yes, the more they screwed up the peace, the more they had a conflict to participate in, right? And that's why they called it, Tom, it was American GIs in Vietnam who coined the phrase self-licking ice cream cone, right? That's what the Pentagon is. And same thing for NATO and the rest of them. Same thing, I guess, an Austrian economist would say about any bureaucracy, right? Is they create their own crises so they have a reason to continue existing. And you don't have to be a conspiracy theorist about it. You could just be an economist and say, well, we observe this phenomenon over and over and over again, that these people find things to do. And, you know, even to, I'm sure this has happened in your state. You do have this happen where firefighters will start a wildfire and then go out and fight it. You know, they get busted doing that from time to time. You know, their department needs their allocation for next year and what have you. It's the economics of bureaucracy. And I never read Mises. I just live here.
The other side is the part that I think most people think about when we think about, quote, NATO expansion. That is the stuff in the 1990s that you've talked about before a number of times, and some other people have, about promises made to the Russians early on that then were broken. And then the question becomes, were these promises really made? And if so, if they were just verbal, then they don't count. I mean, you've gone through this over and over again. I mean, what would be the Reader's Digest version of the truth of the matter?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I guess the Reader's Digest version is that there's an oversimplified tale that says that would be understood, I guess, as meaning, I don't know if anybody ever actually said this, but people understand the argument as being that on one day, James Baker told Gorbachev, we promise never to expand NATO anywhere, ever, ever. And that Gorbachev shook on it, and then they wrote it in a treaty or something. But that's really a red herring, right? That's actually not the argument. And it's true that the war party has found nuance, but then they exploit that nuance and pretend like it shuts down the argument in their favor, which it absolutely does not. So to take their side of the story, to steelman it for you, the treaty that America and the Soviet Union and the German sides, and I guess the British and French also signed, does not say that we promise not to expand NATO into Eastern Europe in that treaty. And the New York Times said there was never a deal of any kind until years later they finally posted all of the notes at the National Security Archive and proved that this had been a part of the discussion the whole time, and that Gorbachev's decision to allow German reunification was based on these promises. Then the New York Times said, well, it wasn't in the treaty, but no one ever really said it was in the treaty. Anybody can read the treaty. No one ever said that. But the point is that there was sort of a double promise. It was built in. And it was also explained, it was stated explicitly numerous times, and even more numerous times implicitly, that NATO would not expand to countries east of Germany. The original discussion between Gorbachev and Baker was about whether NATO would expand to East Germany. And the original promise was that no, if you allow Germany to be reunited, then we won't expand NATO into East Germany. But that kind of doesn't really mean anything, right? Because it's just a political agreement. So if Germany is reunified, then East Germany, of course, is now part of NATO, right? Because it's not like they were unifying under the East. They were unifying under West Berlin's authority, right? So, like, yes, of course they're going, or whoever, West Germany's authority. I guess West Berlin wasn't the capital, but at that time. But what was the capital of West Berlin, Tom? Couldn't have been. I mean, of West Germany. I mean, is what I meant to say.
I don't know. I mean, I assumed that Berlin was was it Bonn?
Oh, yeah, it must have been Bonn. Yeah, it couldn't have been West Berlin while it was surrounded by commies.
Right.
Anyway, I'm sorry. I'm just trying to get my story straight here. The thing is, it doesn't really make sense to say we promise not to expand our alliance into the eastern part of the country. It doesn't really mean anything. So they said, you know what, let's revise that and just say we're not going to move military equipment into the east, into what was the GDR. And so then the war party says, see, Tom, we were backing down from any previous promise about not expanding NATO into even East Germany, because here we're saying, okay, we will, but we're going to have this special military status in the East. So James Baker now says he was backing down from his original promise to not even bring NATO into East Germany into NATO. But then here's the thing about it, and I show the quotes in there over and over again, that I don't think Baker himself, but certainly the Germans repeatedly used the words Hungary and Poland as examples of states east of Germany that also would not be allowed to join NATO. And numerous times this formulation is made in joint conversation or joint announcement with James Baker, and he doesn't contradict it in any way or signal discontent with this formulation in any way. We're not going to expand NATO into Eastern Germany or anywhere east of that either. Now, part of it gets complicated because at the same time, they were promising, this is where I was saying before that George Bush was lying, senior now, because they were telling the Soviets, NATO's not even going to be a military alliance anymore. NATO is going to be a political organization, and we're going to have a new military security system based around the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, which is now called the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And Russia, the Soviet Union, was already a part of the CSCE. And so Bush was saying the CSCE is going to replace NATO. So the question of NATO expansion as a military alliance seemed to mostly be moot. And so there weren't too many more discussions about that because they were lying and saying that that wasn't even on the table, when in fact, in discussions back in Washington, it certainly was. And any plan for using the CSCE, or later they came up with the scheme, the Partnership for Peace, those would just be a halfway house. Those would just be a way to bring these Eastern European countries into NATO eventually, part of the process for bringing them in. While at the same time, they were lying to the Soviets and telling them what they needed to hear, which was that any future security system in Europe will include you as a full-fledged partner. It'll be from Vancouver to Vladivostok, is what Bush Sr. had told them. And so they thought, okay, well, cool. And so that was a huge part of it, where they were taking the question of NATO expansion off the table because they were making it sound like NATO wasn't even going to be a thing anyway. NATO was just going to be basically an agreement with our European friends that they should keep civilian control of their military and have regular elections and settled borders and these kinds of things. That was the way that they were spinning it. But then also, yes, there were, as I said, but should reiterate, there were numerous statements, especially by Hans-Dietrich Genscher, the foreign minister of Germany, who's had every right to speak as for the policy as James Baker did, swearing that we will not move our military forces further into Eastern Europe eventually either. And now you can also see that by making the promise not to move their military equipment into East Germany, Tom, they were still, and that was in the treaty, they were still respecting their promise. See, because if they're allowed to, if everybody knows that it's perfectly acceptable for them to bring Poland and the Baltics into the military alliance and obviously put military equipment in those countries, well, then who cares if we move military equipment into Eastern Germany, if we have them in Eastern Poland? Right? That would make the whole question of whether we're putting military equipment any further east inside Germany totally moot. So they were respecting their earlier promise in the way that they phrased the promises in the treaty anyway. And then the same understanding becomes clear in the NATO-Russia Founding Act of 1997 that Bill Clinton later instituted to try to placate the Russians. to make them allies with the alliance, not ever part of it, to make them co-counsel over there on their separate little thing. But part of the Founding Act was the promise not to put substantial, but still not to move substantial military forces into the new Eastern European NATO states. Again, what are they doing there? They're clearly honoring or attempting to pseudo-honor the promise that Baker made back then about, well, we're not going to expand NATO. Okay, well, if we do, but we're not going to move military equipment and all of this. And then, of course, as I demonstrate in the book, in the councils of government in Washington, D.C., inside the Bush Sr. and the Bill Clinton administrations, they went over and over and around about this stuff. And it's all in writing, not at all, but much of it is in writing. And we know their discussions. We know about Anthony Lake was pushing the hardest and ended up getting Strobe Talbot and Richard Holbrooke on board. And then Richard Holbrooke and Talbot, they outclassed the Secretary of Defense, William Perry, and his aide, Saakashvili, who wanted to hold their horses and not do it. And so he had the diplomats out ahead of the Pentagon on the hawkish policy and all of these things. So we know that all during this time, wiser heads were warning what was going to happen if we do this policy. It was, so it's like, you talk about revisionism. I mean, it's not really revisionism, right? It's just the story. I mean, well, whatever it is compared to what the New York Times said at the time, right? Okay. Like the overall narrative at the time. But at the same time, it's just like, as I said before, 2/3 of the Council on Foreign Relations said we shouldn't be doing this. So this was the consensus, was that this was wrong, but they did it anyway, right? Like you could say in a sense that this was like a wingnut policy pursued by President Bush Sr. and Bill Clinton against the best advice of the foreign policy establishment.
Hey folks, we just finished another successful Woods Mastermind meeting, this one in Boston, and I can't say I'm surprised that some of my sharpest and most successful followers are using Crowd Health. I mean, you look at the mess that is American health insurance, you have to figure there's got to be some kind of alternative out there. It's expensive and frustrating, and let's face it, it's not getting any better. And that's why Crowd Health was created. It's not health insurance. It's a better way to pay for health care through crowdfunding. Crowd Health is doing things differently. For $175 for an individual or $575 for a family of 4 or more, you'll get access to a community of people who are willing to help out in the event of an emergency. You'll get access to telemedicine visits, discounted prescriptions, and so much more, and without doctors' networks getting in the way. Let Crowd Health help with your healthcare needs. Get started today for just $99 per month for your first 3 months. Go to joincrowdhealth.com/woods. Crowd Health is not insurance. Learn more at joincrowdhealth.com/woods. That's joincrowdhealth.com/woods. Isn't it incredible that there was once a foreign policy establishment that might have, had a different opinion from the president or might have thought a different way?
Well, it trips me out that we're talking about the Council on Foreign Relations, which at the time, Tom, I was a New World Order kook, and I thought the Council on Foreign Relations was the secret real government of the world, and I thought that their number one object was to convince Bill Clinton to invite Russia into NATO, and that he was doing it. So therefore, as you could tell, I had no idea what I was talking about. I was reading the New American and not Mises.org, I guess, but I was wrong about that, but I was interested in all this stuff at the time. And in fact, I think they're in a very real sense, maybe, Tom, chapter 1 and 2 of this book represent me grappling with, my own previous disunderstanding of what was going on all of these very same questions that I was so interested in at the time there with this so-called New World Order, as Bush Sr. had announced it, and what that really meant in terms of world government and all of that stuff, And so I was really wrong. I thought that the New World Order meant Russia was going to join NATO, and it was going to be a one world army of the North under the United Nations, and that was your world government. And that was the whole point of the Cold War, was eventually at the end, we're going to join together with them and then lord it over. Probably Islamic South Asia is next, and maybe China after that. And nope, that wasn't it. Dick Cheney was in charge, and that was not his policy, and I was wrong about all that stuff. And so this book is telling the story of what was really going on at the time, as opposed to what I thought was going on at the time.
All right, fair enough. Let me share a couple of more. There's just so many gems in this thing. We're not even scratching the surface. But I want to share a couple of passages that really are other people that you're quoting. But they're such important people. So the first one is from late 1996, and George Kennan. And of course, George Kennan was one of the great architects of the American policy during the Cold War, and he can hardly be accused of being a Russian sympathizer. And he describes NATO expansion as a strategic blunder of potentially epic proportions. So in 1997, he writes in the New York Times that that NATO expansion was, quote, the most fateful error of American policy in the entire post-Cold War era, that it would inflame the existing nationalistic, anti-Western, and militaristic tendencies in Russian opinion, restore the atmosphere of the Cold War to East-West relations, and impel Russian foreign policy in directions decidedly not to our liking. And then, in 1998, he said that I think it is the beginning, it being NATO expansion, of a new Cold War. I think the Russians will gradually react quite adversely, and it will affect their policies. I think it is a tragic mistake. There was no reason for this whatsoever. No one was threatening anybody else. This expansion would make the founding fathers of this country turn over in their graves. We have signed up to protect a whole series of countries, even though we have neither the resources nor the intention to do so in any serious way. Don't people understand? Our differences in the Cold War were with the Soviet communist regime, and now we are turning our backs on the very people who mounted the greatest bloodless revolution in history to remove that Soviet regime. Of course, there's going to be a bad reaction from Russia, and then the NATO expanders will say that we always told you that is how the Russians are, but this is just wrong. And then if I may, one more, Scott.
Absolutely.
This one's from Pat Buchanan, 1999. Quote, if rising resentment in Russia leads to Yeltsin's replacement with an anti-American nationalist, full blame must rest squarely with a haughty U.S. elite that has done its best to humiliate Russia. And then he goes on to say, why are we doing this? This is not 1948. Stalin is dead. The Soviet Empire is dead. The Soviet Union is dead. European Russia is smaller than the Russia of Peter the Great. A friendly Russia is far more critical to U.S. security than any alliance with Warsaw or Prague. If the United States has one overriding national security interest in the new century, it is to avoid collisions with great nuclear powers like Russia. And then finally, by moving NATO onto Russia's front porch, we have scheduled a 21st century confrontation. America will face a hellish dilemma: risk confrontation with a nuclear-armed Russia determined to recreate its old sphere of influence, or renege on solemn commitments and see NATO collapse. So therefore, he says, offering NATO memberships to Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and as some urge, Ukraine, is rashness bordering on madness, unquote. Now, I feel like those quotations more or less speak for themselves, but if you'd like to say something further, please do.
Yeah, I mean, what can you say, dude? Pat Buchanan was no hippie. This is Ronald Reagan's guy. He was an anti-Russia guy until Russia wasn't the Soviet Union anymore, right? Christmas Day, 1991, he quit being a Russia hawk. And, but he's no less conservative and no less patriotic. And he just knows better. I mean, what can you say about Pat Buchanan? The guy writes incredible history books. He's a brilliant guy. You read one of his books and you realize how many books he's read. You know, this is whatever, right? That's Pat's problem. He knows too much to go along with this stuff, man. And so he's, you know, he says, quite importantly, he points to Kaliningrad, which is this small strip of land between Lithuania and Poland on the Baltic Sea, which of course is accessible by sea. But the only other way to access it from Russia is a railway across Belarus and Lithuania. They have an easement called the Suwalki Corridor across Lithuania to get to their military base, their naval base. And I mean, man, if that doesn't smack of Danzig in Germany before the outbreak of World War II, or for the potential for a crisis, for having their city, or Berlin, locked away from West Berlin, locked away from the rest of West Germany for that matter, that is a very obvious potential flashpoint for nuclear war throughout the whole Cold War there in Berlin. And this Kaliningrad situation is akin to that. And Pat says, look, from the Russians' point of view, if we bring in the Baltics, and that means we strand, Kaliningrad is now stranded behind NATO lines. That's just a tripwire for war. Now, what happened in 22? When the Russians invaded, the Lithuanians got all brave and they closed off access to that railway across the Suwalki corridor in the name of enforcing EU sanctions. And it was only when and I just remembered that great quote. That's not in the book. Wait. I need this. The quote from the Lithuanian guy talking tough. Where's my pen? Somebody email this to me later. There was I said this in the debate with stupid old Kathy Young. Where's my pen? Here. That was what I dropped earlier. That quote from the Lithuanian guy going, oh yeah, no, we would never act this tough except for the Americans got our back and they're making us feel brave. And like, you know what I mean? Like you couldn't have written the line for him better, where he's saying like, we have a moral hazard that Joe Biden gave us that said that we should talk real tough to the Russians because what are they going to do about it? And yeah, and you're right. We would never act this way if we were not being incentivized to by Joe Biden right now, right? Like it's just as plain as day in the New York Times. And that is, I say this in the book too, that especially these Democrats, but all of them, and the war party types, they act like NATO is just a cocktail party circuit for fancy pants people to go and drink and be seen with each other at night or whatever these people do. You know what I mean? Which is true. That is what NATO is a fancy pants cocktail party circuit. I bet like if you were a foreign minister in Europe, you would get to go and drink wine at chateaus and things, right? Places with thick carpet and really expensive clothing or whatever. But these are war guarantees. So you can get all dressed up at night or whatever, but don't forget what Pat said, that what you just did is you promised to fight a nuclear war for Estonia's independence. Did you really check that with the people of Kansas and Texas first? That we're going to die for Estonia? Or even Poland. I don't know how they convince anybody we'd fight for Germany after we just fought against them in the war a minute ago. Maybe if they drew the line at France, I'd have bought that. They're our oldest ally. But I'm supposed to give up Austin, Texas for Warsaw? And not because Stalin's coming, but because Putin's coming? Forget it. And especially not Ukraine or the Baltic states. Like, I'm sorry, I do not think that Russia has the right to rule the Lithuanians. I also think that no one has the right to force the people of Texas into a war to guarantee their independence. Not for the next 1 million years.
Well, let's finish with this, and then we will, as time goes on, we're going to keep bringing you back. We're going to go through this whole story. But most of this early material has to do with this subject of what's the U.S. and its military establishment going to do in this new world? And a lot of it has to do with the decision to expand NATO. But since the book is about, the subtitle covers both, covers the Cold War against Russia and also the disaster in Ukraine. But let's say something about Ukraine specifically. What's the first time after 1990 or starting in 1990 that the subject of Ukraine being a potentially sensitive, a sore subject, comes up in any of these deliberations, Ukraine specifically?
Oh, yeah. Well, right from the beginning, right? Because this is the entire definition of whether the Soviet Union is still the Soviet Union or not, is whether they still pwn the Baltics, Belarus, and Ukraine. And Yeltsin's conspiracy against Gorbachev was to make a deal with Ukraine and Belarus to break away. And once they did that, there was no Soviet Union for Gorbachev to be the premier of anymore. So Yeltsin was able to push him out all the rest of the way finally and become the president of Russia with all the power there. So that was the death of the USSR, was the independence of Ukraine. And they were actually about to form, they were going to write what was called the New Union Treaty. The Americans supported this, saving the USSR. But the commies did a coup. They were going to sign it on August 20th. But the commies launched a coup on the 18th of 1991, and they failed. But in reaction to their failed commie coup, then everybody else just declared independence quickly after that. Ukraine, the Baltics, Kazakhstan, and the rest. And that was the final unraveling through the rest of the year from August through December. And then it was Christmas Day 91 when the Soviet flag finally came down from the Kremlin. It was all the way kaput there. So then so Russia's relationship with Ukraine, of course, goes back to the very beginning. Russian civilization began in Kiev, not in Moscow. They moved to Moscow, and there's been, of course, anybody who's watching this show, I'm sure, is familiar with like maps of Europe, political maps of Europe over time, and the lines are just drawn and redrawn everywhere every time a potentate dies or, war breaks out, which is always. And so this land was always constantly divided up by different powers, including the Russians, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and others. And but you had in what's called Novorussia, which is basically the land that Putin has retaken now, is Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson were the furthest east and southern Ukrainian oblasts there, and of course the Crimean Peninsula as well. And these were all taken by the Russian Empire under Catherine the Great. And then under communism, the Vladimir Lenin drew the border where the Donbass area and all this would be part of Ukraine, SSR, as opposed to part of Russia, SSR, Soviet Socialist Republic, as opposed to part of Russia. And they did that in order to kind of divide and conquer the Ukrainians, not so much divide them, but to burden them with a Russian population to leave them divided and conquered in a sense, right? That was what colonialists would do. They can't divide and conquer you, they'll group you together with different groups to keep you now divided and conquered in the new paradigm, kind of thing. So this is how Ukraine came to end up owning the eastern part of itself, that had been part of Russia before the war. Now, at independence, the question was what was going to happen. And Yeltsin's highest priority was kissing up to H.W. Bush and the United States and the West. He did not want to, and he would certainly jeopardize that if he got into a war with Ukraine. So there was a real question, well, what's going to happen to the Donbass and what's going to happen to Crimea? And, I have a whole kind of history, especially in the Crimean section where I get into a lot of the backstory there in the time from 1990 and 91 all the way through 2014 when they lost Crimea back to Russia. I should add that Crimea, still, unlike the Donbass, Crimea did belong to Russia all the way until 1954, when after Stalin died, Khrushchev gifted it to Ukraine, but it had been part of Russia up until 54. But anyway, point being that there was the potential for war, and there was a moment in, I guess, 92, I think it was early 92, when the Yeltsin government threatened that maybe they would take the Donbass. And they let it blow over because they were sucking up to the Americans. They basically compromised. But in other words, the point being that there was always a real controversy over these heavily Russian areas of eastern Ukraine, which is, it's not exactly the same, but it's somewhat analogous to if in Texas it was all Hispanics south of the San Jacinto and all Anglos north of there. Like you really are kind of talking two nations in one here, right? Or something like that. Well, whatever. It's different in Texas. We're all mixed up and don't care, but whatever. Bad analogy, but you understand what I'm saying. That like you have the Czechs and the Slovaks stuck together in one nation together where they don't necessarily fit together, right? That would be the analogy. So now the Czechs and the Slovaks, they were allowed to split apart. But with Ukraine, no. And so then it's always, just like in the United States now, it's absolute life or death over who wins the election. Because who wins the election absolutely determines whether they're going to go toward Russia or whether they're going to go toward the West. They're going to sign with the EU. They're going to sign with Russia. They're going to join NATO. They're going to join the CIS. So they're going to, we force them to be either or. And importantly, Tom, from the time of H.W. Bush, certainly from the time of Bill Clinton, and then all the way through, wise men, even bad ones and not so wise ones like Brzezinski and Kissinger, who both supported NATO expansion, they both also had 10,000 words of caution about how to proceed on the issue of Ukraine. And, Michael O'Hanlon, remember him and Ken Pollack, who did so much to convince liberals to support Iraq War II? He wrote a whole giant thing that came out, I guess, in 2017. No one paid attention because of Russiagate stupidity. There was a big proposal that what we need to do is we need to make Ukraine permanently on a Finland-type basis during the Cold War. So Finland and Austria during the last Cold War had this sort of permanent neutral status, which deprived Stalin of a reason to want to attack them, right? And they promised not to join with the West if the East would leave them alone. And that was certainly the best way to handle Ukraine. You had this absolutely divided population in terms of not just ethnicity, but in all types of political questions. You had nothing like consensus for NATO membership for Ukraine. So what they could have, should have done is just completely encoded Ukrainian neutrality. Let it be the bridge between the East and the West. Don't force them to join. And by forcing them to join, you cause the war. And this is in the famous Niet means Niet memo. Our current CIA director, William Burns, was then the ambassador to Russia in 2008, when he warned Condoleezza Rice, the Secretary of State, not to issue the Budapest Declaration inviting or to issue a membership action plan to invite Ukraine and or Georgia to join the NATO alliance. He said, listen, Georgia's one thing, but man, if you try to bring Ukraine into NATO, you're going to start a war. The Russians, this is the brightest of red lines. He says the most enlightened liberals to the most backwards knuckle draggers in the darkest recesses of the Kremlin. There is 100% consensus against this. They say, if you do this, it could cause a civil war in Ukraine, and then we might have to intervene, which is something that we don't want to do. Please, we're begging you, Ambassador Burns, Sergei Lavrov told him. Don't put us in this position, man. And Burns said to Rice, you should listen to him. Okay? This is right. He's saying, call it. Call it here. Or call it your quit while you're ahead. You got the Baltics? You don't need Ukraine. That's our current CIA director talking in 2008. The guy who didn't see Biden through a way to avoid this war, and who's helping him prosecute it now, is the guy who warned we should not do this. And in fact, Tom, he wrote an email to her right after that, reiterating, I know there's all kinds of pressure on you to do this, Madam Secretary, but you gotta think for the big picture. Don't think about Bush's legacy. Oh, that was what they said. It's a legacy building operation, right? This is now public choice theory. This is about how George Bush can go down in history as a great leader. Has nothing to do with what makes any sense for America, for Russia, for France, for Germany, for Ukraine. It's all about, W. Bush thinks this is going to make him a great leader since Iraq didn't quite work out like he thought, huh? And that was the purpose, but it was that they used that word legacy building for W. Bush. And he says to her, he goes, I'm sorry, if you're not with me, you might as well stop reading this email now. Because the rest of it is just me saying the same thing again, only better. But like, man, if you're not on board with what I'm telling you, Madam Secretary, I just don't know what to do with you. We should not be doing this. That's William Burns. Again, that's not Ron Paul, who always says we should not be doing this, rightly. But that's William Burns. And so there, by the rules of confirmation bias, that means me and Ron Paul are extra right.
Scott, this book goes all the way up to exactly when? Like as soon as yesterday, as recently as possible?
Yes. There's a color-coded revolution going on in Georgia right now. There's North Korean troops fighting, supposedly being brought to the front in Kursk, where we have a Ukrainian incursion inside Russian lines right as we speak, Tom. So I'm updating the book, all the way up until publication day.
Fantastic. All right, tell us again, because again, we're just starting the very beginning material, but you got to start from the beginning. So tell us again, what's that website where people can go and pre-order? Because you should go pre-order, because this is the greatest feat of scholarship that we've had in our world in a very long time. So tell us.
Thank you, Tom. Appreciate that very much. It's provokedbook.com. And don't fret when it forwards you. It's just going to forward you to my website, scotthorton.org/provoked. And we're taking your pre-orders there. And I'm really excited about it. It should be just another 2-3 weeks for the very, very final copy editing now. And I mean very, very final read through now. And then it's simply just page numbers and headers in TOC. And you're not getting an index. You want to index by the Kindle. So that's it. It's Provoked. How Washington started the new Cold War with Russia and the catastrophe in Ukraine. John Mearsheimer calls it manna from heaven. Tom Woods says, I'm an actual scholar now.
That's not how I put it.
And I do. It is comprehensive. And also, don't be too intimidated by the size, because as Tom said, there's 6,000 footnotes, more than 7,000 citations in here. So that's a lot of the length of the book, is the proof of what I'm telling you. So it shouldn't be too bad of a read, and it should be kind of a fun one. So I hope people like it.
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, it is like a novel, but it's a weird novel because you know how it ends, and so you're watching the disaster unfold, and then you have these prescient voices, and you think, why isn't anybody listening to them? But the answer is nobody ever listens to the prescient voices. I don't know. It's just a fact of mankind.
Yep.
Anyway.
Well, listen, I can't tell you how much I appreciate all your support, Tom. It means a lot to me.
Scott, I support you because you're eminently worthy of support. So I'm very glad that the project is just about in the rearview mirror for you. Now we can get out there and promote it. So provokedbook.com is the place to go. Scott Horton, thanks so much.
Thank you, sir.
And don't forget, Scott is joining me on the Tom Woods cruise. So check that out too. After you do the pre-order, then go to tomwoodscruise.com and book your cabin, because we're going to have a great time. Thanks so much, everybody.
Make yourself and those you love less vulnerable to the regime, both mentally and physically. Get more forbidden information at tomsfreebooks.com, and be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you listen. See you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.